Okay, welcome AP European History students. This is chapter 13, and again, it looks like this will be a theme for all of the presentations for AP Euro. It's going to be longer than what you're used to with APUSH and AP World. So, sorry about that. Not really anything we can do about it, though. Now, a lot of information in this chapter. It can be very confusing. Our main thrust here being the Reformation and the religious warfare in the 16th century. Now, you can pause that for the focus questions. It is important that you look at these focus questions. The idea behind them is that these are things you're looking to answer. So it'd be a good idea to read through them, but to try to make this presentation a little bit shorter, I will not be doing so here. Okay. The star of the show is somebody you're familiar with, at least here in the beginning of this, and that is Martin Luther. But before Luther comes some other people that will certainly influence Luther. All right, now a term you need to know is Christian humanist. These people are part of the Northern Renaissance. We know the Renaissance, of course, started in Italy. We know the reasons why it started there. It does spread north. The Northern Renaissance is much more religious in nature. The theme is the reform of the church and society. Basically, that the church has become corrupt over the last 1,000 years or so, and that it needs to be reformed. The focus here is on early Christian writings, back when they thought that Christianity was pure. They're also looking at Greco-Roman classics as well. And they want this simple Christianity. Basically, what's happened is that the Catholic Church has become very ornate, and it has more ceremonies than what the church had when it first started. And basically, we want to return to that there in the north. Christian humanists did anyway. They also believe in the power of education to improve oneself. And by doing that, it would lead you to intrinsic within piety, that you would have faith from within. Big name you got to know is Erasmus. You see his life there, long-lived. He is the most influential Northern humanist, and it's often said that he laid the egg that Luther hatched. He is before Luther. Luther is going to be influenced by reading works of Erasmus, and he has several. A Handbook of the Christian Knight. He believes that the daily life should be guided by Christ, this inner faith, not the external forms of religion. He doesn't care about church rituals, chanting, idol worship, or anything like that, or icons. Remember iconoclasm? Basically, a simple church that it comes from within. He writes, probably his most famous work is The Praise of Folly, where he's criticizing, corrupt church members and things like that, making fun of priests who get drunk and stuff like that. In Julius Exclusus, he even takes on Pope Julius, who was known as the warrior pope, and he's criticizing him. This is right after he had died, and he's writing this exchange of Pope Julius talking with St. Peter, trying to get into heaven, and then he starts, wanting to fight and stuff like that, basically making fun of this pope who was a warrior when him and many people feel like the Pope should be only spiritual matters, that the Renaissance popes became too engrossed in spiritual matter or in material matters. They were living in palaces and they were collecting paintings and stuff like that. Excuse me. Erasmus was also behind a revised edition of the New Testament there in 1516. So he's a big one. Got to know him. Another big name is Thomas More. Now, associate Thomas More with being English. He's a politically powerful person, Lord Chancellor of England. Most famously writes Utopia. And in Utopia, the social system there, the people cooperate. They use reason. They're not worried about being famous and powerful. Those motivations do not drive them. There's communal ownership, and there's no private property. And because of that, it leads to less conflict. But don't get it twisted. Thomas More does not want a split in the Catholic Church. He is very devoted to the Catholic Church, so much so that when King Henry VIII splits from the Catholic Church, he will be executed because he refuses to acknowledge King Henry as the supreme leader of the church. Picture of Erasmus there. All right. Now, important word here too. So we're talking about church and religion right here close to the Reformation. We're almost ready for Martin Luther to come in. We get something called pluralism. This is important to a lot of people who are looking for reform. Under pluralism, the clergy are doing more than one job. You could be a priest and, say, a carpenter, or a priest and, whatever. They're doing that to make more money because they're not paid that well. And that leads to absenteeism. Sometimes they're like, well, sorry, I couldn't make it Sunday for Mass. My other job, I had to do something for my other job. And that's a problem because the people believe that a priest should be devoted to the faith first and foremost. So there's a search for salvation. There's veneration of relics and saints, which makes salvation seem mechanical. People are basically getting tired with all the bells and whistles that have come along with Catholicism over many hundreds of years. And even in this modern devotion, in the time period here, some people are looking to mysticism for meaningful religious experience. You get Thomas Campus's The Imitation of Christ, just basically writing about being spiritual to Jesus. There are calls for reform, internal forces of change within the Catholic Church. That's important, not external. There's no kings aren't forcing this. This is something that some within the church itself are questioning. Hey, is this really the route we want to go? Well, come on. Got a little lag here. All right. Now it's time for Martin Luther. Okay, so we know from World that Martin Luther initially was going to school to be a lawyer. His family had sent him there and paid for his education, but he ends up getting a doctorate in theology after a near lightning strike. He changes his life. Basically, he believes that the Bible is the sole religious authority for Christianity. None of the church ceremonies that Catholics are using, and he is Catholic himself, but he's fallen out of favor with it. He just believes that the Bible, if it's not written in the Bible, then it's made up. He also doesn't believe that humans are saved by doing good works. He doesn't believe that you can score points for heaven. If you do some bad things and then you just do more good things, that you get to go to heaven. He doesn't believe in that. But really what sets him off, of course, famously, is the indulgence controversy. And that happens with Johann Tetzel, who's basically this clergy member who's trying to raise money to build a church. And he is selling indulgences to do so, basically pardons for sin, or you've done bad things, and the Pope has allowed me to give you an indulgence that will keep you out of purgatory, this in-between place between heaven and hell. And this is going to lead Martin Luther to stand up for several days and writing his 95 Theses, which of course are going to be taken and nailed up on the door to Wittenberg Castle there in Germany. Now, we're going to learn Martin Luther in more detail than ever before. I certainly learned some interesting facts about the man myself. All right. Now, 1520. There are pamphlets being passed around by Martin Luther. And thanks to the printing press, of course, his ideas are being spread more easily. We have a problem. Germany is very fractured. There are all these German princesses that rule over basically provinces in the Holy Roman Empire. And the address to the nobility of the German nation actually asked German princes to overthrow the papacy, the Pope, and establish a new church. We also get the Babylonian captivity of the church, which was written in Latin. It attacked the sacrament system as a way that the church held the gospel hostage. Basically, that you have to be allowed sacraments to be able to get to heaven. We get on the freedom of a Christian man. Faith brings salvation and freedom from agony and temptation. Faith is what saves you. If you believe in Jesus, that's what saves you, not the Pope and not the sacraments of the church. But this is going to push the Pope too far, who initially dismissed Luther as being unimportant, wasn't concerned, but this thing gains legs. And so eventually, at the Diet of Worms in the city of Worms, Germany, Martin Luther is going to be declared an outlaw, and that he's going to be excommunicated from the church, and that anyone protecting him will be guilty of harboring an outlaw. However, he is saved by his prince, who is the Elector of Saxony, which is a German province, and he's saved at Wartburg Castle. And there's a picture of Wartburg Castle. While he's there, Martin Luther's going to translate the Bible into German, into common vernacular. And another big difference between Martin Luther and Catholics, well, Catholics believe in celibacy, although they didn't always follow that rule. A Catholic priest wasn't allowed to marry. Martin Luther did not believe in this, and he himself marries Katharina von Bora. And that's going to be an example for many other Protestant, what becomes Protestantism. Protestant ministers will marry. Luther's German New Testament became very popular, again, because Germans could read it themselves. Because remember, he's saying that the Bible is the ultimate God, not the Pope who's talking in Latin. Who's you got a priest up there reading from a Latin book. You can't check them and make sure that what they're saying is right. So sermons and images were printed in pamphlets. His ideas are spreading. In the beginning, it's sticking to the cities for the most part. Nuremberg, Germany, was the first city to actually convert to Lutheranism. And it gained support from the upper classes, which is pretty important. And there is dissent within the ranks and the humanists. Not everyone will be enamored of Martin Luther. Like I said, Thomas More, many of these Christian humanists, they're looking for reform of the church. But what Martin Luther has basically, and although he didn't initially want to do this, basically we're seeing a split in the Catholic Church. Eventually, we will get the Peasants' War by 1524. And Luther's stance on this is that rulers are appointed by God. And the peasants mistakenly think that Luther would back them up. They take this advantage to kind of fight against their overlords. And he doesn't back them up. He doesn't want to lose the backing of the rich and the powerful, to be honest. You could make an argument that he sells out the people to keep favor from the rich and the prestigious. So politically, who's this religious freedom for? And what kind of freedom does Luther intend? He's not intending religious freedom to worship how you please. He just sees that his ideas are better than the Catholic churches. All right, so organizing this new church, we get state churches, these Protestant churches, and new religious services that are far less ornate, far more simplistic than what the Catholic Church has been doing. Sacraments. There used to be 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church, but Luther's only going to keep 2 of them. The only 2 that he finds are important. One is baptism, basically a rebirth through grace, and the Lord's Supper. Luther denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, but he did believe that Christ was present. Basically, Catholics believe that literally the wine and the bread were the body of Christ. Luther doesn't believe that, but he does believe that Christ is present when you're doing this. So he keeps these 2 of the 7 sacraments. Now, since Scripture was the ultimate authority, there's no need for a hierarchy of clergy. You're not going to have abbots and monks and priests and bishops and archbishops. You don't need all that. It's a simpler church. He believes the true church is this invisible entity and a priesthood of all believers, basically meaning that by reading the Bible, you are your own priest. Much more simplistic. He relies on the princes to organize the churches. Remember, they're state-led. He's going to and this keeps him in good with the rich princes as well. New religious services were done in vernacular instead of Latin, and they had a lot of Bible readings. There was preaching, of course, and they sang. There was song. Again, he denounced celibacy, and he himself marries a nun, which, of course, gives a new role for women as ministers' wives. Luther versus the Pope. And here's an important chronology, and I think this is big for Martin Luther. His 95 Thesis is written in 1517. Now, it takes a little bit of time to get the ball rolling. But by 1519, you have the Leipzig debate. And what that was, you had a debate, essentially, between Martin Luther and a man who's considered the master of all debaters, which is Johann Eck. And Eck is so good at debating that he will force Luther into a position that has him admitting his heresy. And so to try to win the debate, Luther basically takes the bait, has to admit he's a heretic, and he says, hey, the Pope has no power. He is not named in the Bible. It is a made-up position by men, and there's no purgatory. He doesn't believe in it. It's not in the Bible. The Bible's his highest authority. Now that is going to lead to the diet of worms. The edict of worms is the result of the diet of worms. Diet is the meeting. The edict is the result, and the result basically excommunicates Martin Luther from the church. And again, he supposedly punishes people for protecting him, but he gets his protection. The Peasants' War. The peasants do a lot of damage. They burn manors and they kill noblemen, and Luther turns on them. So that's the most important chronology from Luther's part in the Reformation. All right, now let's look a little bit of the Reformation, religion and politics. So we got a man named Charles V. You need to know this guy. He becomes, at first, he's Charles I of Spain, and he just rules over Spain. But he will become, because of bloodlines, he will become Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This means that he controls Spain and its colonies, think in the New World, the Austrian Habsburg lands, he is a Habsburg, Bohemia, Hungary, the Low Countries, which is the Netherlands, and the Kingdom of Naples in southern Italy. So he's powerful. He wants to maintain control of his empire, and use Catholicism as the tool for uniformity, the thing that they all have in common, because these are very different cultures, of course. But he's got a lot of problems. One of his problems, of course, is the French, who are surrounded by his lands and view him as a threat. The Pope is actually an issue for him as well, and the new power of the Turks. And then within his own, the own heart of his empire is, of course, the German Reformation. So a lot of issues with Charles V, who is devoted to Catholicism. Now, let's take them in parts here. Let's go with France and the papacy. So Francis I, the king of France, is Charles V's rival. Francis considers Charles his subject, not his equal, and that's a big problem. This is going to lead to the Habsburg and Valois Wars. Valois being the ruling part. Francis is a Valois. They are the French monarchy versus the Habsburgs, which are Austrian and Spanish, in this case being Charles V. The alliance of Pope Clement VII, again, popes wielding political power and fielding armies. Pope Clement VII allies with Francis I because the Pope feared Charles' power in Italy, because Charles owned southern Italy right next to the Papal States. This will result in the sack of Rome by Charles's armies in 1527, which, for all intents and purposes, probably ends the Italian Renaissance. So again, Charles V, he's winning battles, but he's not really going to win the war. And here's a chart of the complicated bloodlines and marriages. We'll go into that in a little more detail in class. So another problem, the Turks and then Germany. The Ottoman Empire has beaten Constantinople and has ended the Byzantine Empire. And now they've taken over Hungary. They're moving into Austria. They are a very real threat. They are under the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, who you can see rules for a long 46 years. Fortunately for the Europeans, Suleiman's armies are repulsed at Vienna in Italy, which was a very scary moment for Charles, because they're just that close to the Turks taking over huge chunks of Europe. Now, the politics in Germany might be even the worst part. Very fragmented. You got all these princesses who have separate power. And that's not going to work in Charles V's favor whatsoever. So what's he going to do? Well, we're going to call up another meeting. A diet is basically a meeting. The Diet of Augsburg in 1530. This is a meeting between Catholics and Protestants to address religious conflict. Too many people are dying. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people dying and killing because of religious affiliation, Protestant versus Catholic. Now, Charles V demands that Lutherans, who are Protestant, come back to Catholicism. It's not going to happen. That can of worms is empty and it's not going back. The Schmalkaldic League was formed in defense. So Protestants, they do a pretty good job militarily. And they have these alliances between certain provinces and cities in Germany. These wars last for about a year, and German Protestants allied actually with French Catholics. It gets complicated. So it's political and religious. So even though Catholics have a problem with Protestants, French Catholics are willing to aid German Protestants to weaken the power of Charles V. This gets so much, it's such a big deal to Charles V, who's, this devout Catholic who's trying to unite his lands, and he just seemingly hit on every side, that he actually says, I'm done, and he retires from the throne and goes and lives out in the countryside. It's incredible. What we will end up with a few years after that is the Peace of Augsburg. And it's an important thing, you have to know it. What this does is that the division of Christianity is official now. It's acknowledged. It's no longer just a private issue. It is officially acknowledged. But it does not give religious freedom for the people. The people can't, they can't worship, Islam. They have to worship what their prince. If you live in Saxony and the Prince of Saxony wants Lutheranism, that's what you will worship. You don't have a choice. If you live in another province that worships Catholicism, you will worship Catholicism there. So it basically allows the princes to choose the faith for the people. That's very important to note. Here you can get a little map, and you've got these divisions. Spain is divided between Aragon and Castile. We know that there's going to be a coming unification there. Here are the outlines of the Holy Roman Empire. Here. Here's in different lands controlled by Charles V. He's going to end up controlling these lands here. So you're France, you're surrounded. Here's Charles V. Here's Charles V. Here's Charles V. You're surrounded by Charles V. That's an issue. A painting here of Charles V. Funny quote: "I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to gentlemen, and German to my horse." So I find that amusing. Here's a chronology. We're not even going to go through his chronology like we did Martin Luther's, but it is there for you to see. And you're going to have to try to keep some dates straight. That's going to be one of the most difficult parts in AP Euro. All right, so Protestant Reformation is spreading. We need to find out the beliefs of Lutheranism, and we've covered several of those. Then we get Zwinglianism, Anabaptism, and Calvinism. These are all Protestant groups, but they have small differences. How they differ from each other and how they differ from Catholicism. What is political, social, and economic conditions have? What effect did they have on the development of these four reform movements? So let's look at that. All right, so let's look at Lutheranism in Scandinavia, these northern areas, Sweden and Finland and Norway. Monarchs had state-run churches there. Kings were the supreme ecclesiastical authorities, meaning they were the supreme church authorities as well. There was no separation of church and state. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, these areas, under Lutheranism, state-controlled. Then we get Zwinglian Reformation. His is Switzerland. You have 13 cantons or states of the Swiss Confederation. Confederation meaning this, loose alliance of different areas. Loosely united, self-governing. Now, his reforms happened in Zurich, and his name is Ulrich Zwingli. And look at his dates there. He's a crossover with Martin Luther. He's the son of a wealthy peasant, which is kind of odd in itself. He was an educated humanist, and he was influenced by Erasmus and a cathedral priest. He had his own interpretation of the gospel, and he criticized the Swiss mercenary industry, these guys who go out and fight for money. He advocated for the clergy's right to marry, so he agrees with Luther there that the clergy should be able to marry. So he disagrees with the Catholic Church, but he wanted the state to supervise the church. He abandoned relics, images, paintings, decoration, and even music. Luther would use music, but Zwingli's not even using music. But all these Catholic things here, these relics and images and paintings, he's abandoning that. He also abolished monasteries. He gets rid of saints, not using saints, and he gets rid of celibacy. So there's some differences between him and the Catholic Church there. Now, there's going to be no unity in Switzerland and these 13 cantons. The forest cantons remain Catholic. He's afraid that they're going to ally themselves with the Habsburgs because remember Charles V is wanting everybody to be Catholic. Zwingli reaches out. He wants to ally with Martin Luther and the German reformers so that they can kind of hold out against Catholic power. But the German princes also feared Charles V's power. They're dealing with him. We get Prince Philip of Hesse, who invites them for a conference at the Marburg Collegium, and Luther and Zwingli argue. So these two Protestant titans get into an argument, and they argue over a doctrinal issue of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, as they say in Catholicism, and whether Christ is present in the bread and wine. Zwingli believes that he is literally present in the bread and wine, whereas, again, Martin Luther does not believe that. And this argument is going to be as such that the two men cannot agree with each other. And so there will be no alliance between Germany and Switzerland. So we get the Swiss Civil Wars in 1531. Again, all of this is religiously and politically motivated. So Swiss Catholics go to it with the Zwinglians, these Protestants. Zwingli himself is actually killed in battle and cut into pieces and cremated. And if I'm not mistaken, cremation was not a part of what he believed in. So this was like the ultimate, they cut his body up, and then instead of burying him, they're going to cremate him. Luther is a little bit of a jerk about this, and he actually approved of it because he doesn't believe in Zwingli. And Luther has some his own motivations. Here's a map of the Swiss cantons. So you have a Swiss area, and you have it divided up into these provinces called cantons. There's Zwingli himself. All right, we get another, even more radical changing of the Catholic Church, and even the changing. What you have basically is you have a split, and then the Protestants begin splitting and splitting and splitting. We get the Anabaptist. Now, this church was a voluntary association of believers. They believe in adult baptism, that baptizing babies doesn't mean anything because they don't know what they're doing. Adult baptism, accepting Jesus into your heart, that's important to them. They return to the practice of the very early Christian church. And different than Zwingli, different than Martin Luther, different than what's going on in the Scandinavian countries, they believe in a separation of church and state. They also believe, however, in a priesthood of all believers. So there's some similarities with them and Martin Luther. There were varieties of Anabaptism. Swiss Anabaptists were actually persecuted in Germany and Austrian Habsburg lands and Switzerland. They're considered more radical than the other ones. You get the John of Leyden, Munster, as New Jerusalem, the city of Munster. They believe it's a new holy site. Leyden and other middle areas were crushed by the Catholic Prince Bishop of Munster, who is not excited about this radical group. The Dutch Anabaptism then became pacifist and nonviolent. Anabaptists are going to become Mennonites and basically the Amish down the line. So Mennonites try to imitate the life of Jesus, so they separate themselves from the world. The movement spread to many parts of Europe and America. We get the Amish, or the Pennsylvania Dutch, as they were sometimes called, and they were descended from this religious movement. So they are, one of the most radical groups. They're not going to fight wars. They're pacifists. They believe in nonviolence, and they live in these little utopian communities, these little Amish communities. All right, now we switch over to England. How does the Reformation affect England? Of course, when we think of this, we think of Henry VIII, who we've got a little bit of background from our world history days. His first wife, and of roughly 20 years or so, was Catherine of Aragon, Spanish territory, if you remember the map a couple slides ahead. They have a daughter together, Mary. That's his firstborn. He wants a son, of course. Once Catherine has reached the end of her childbearing days, her years, he wants an annulment. But the Pope Clement VII still, will not allow for an annulment uh, because of Charles V, who is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, and he worries about Charles V's power more so than Henry VIII. So he refuses to allow this to happen. And so we know that that Henry is going to break away from the church. His main policymakers are Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But the big one here you need to know is the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which makes Henry not only the King of England, but the head of both church and state. He follows that up with the Treason Act, which made it punishable by death to deny the king's ecclesiastical authority. You actually had to sign a piece of paper saying, I agree that the king is the head of the Catholic Church. Thomas More, we mentioned him earlier with Utopia, refused to do this, and so he was beheaded. Now, Henry has replaced Catherine and married Anne Boleyn. They too have a daughter whose name is Elizabeth. But he falls out of favor with Anne Boleyn and ends up having her beheaded and on treason, saying that she was sleeping with her brother, incest and stuff like this, just stuff he made up, really. He then marries Jane Seymour, who gives him the son that he's always wanted, Edward. But of course, Jane Seymour dies like 2 weeks after that happens. So Henry marries Anne of Cleves, but he had, married her. He agreed to marry her before he ever saw her in person. He saw a painting of her, and he was attracted to her, but in person, she didn't look nearly as good. She's too ugly. He divorces her. Why not? He's already done so many times now. So his next wife is Catherine Howard, who's only 15. He beheads her also for adultery. His last and his sixth wife is the wealthy widow, Catherine Parr, because Henry is broke and he has made England broke at this point. She does outlive him, but convinces Henry to restore his daughters Mary and Elizabeth to the lineage, which is important because Edward will not live very long. He will become king for only a couple of years before he dies, and this will give us the first queens of England, Mary first, and then Elizabeth, of course, who will follow. There's Henry and his wives. All right, now, Cromwell becomes Henry's chief advisor. They close all religious Catholic houses. They confiscate land and property of the church. They sell the land to the people that support him. So here's political. This isn't religious. This is political. He is gaining power and wealth from stealing from the Catholic Church. He cut ties with the Pope, but he doesn't really make any doctrinal changes to the new Anglican Church. Basically, he just slaps a new label on it. It's a Catholic Church, but it's called the Anglican Church now, and I'm the head of it. True English reformers wanted a real reformation, not this fake one that the king has done, just so he could get these divorces, basically. So this led to religious conflict in England. England's going to be, going to have conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism. So Henry dies. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, becomes king. Obviously, that's a little bit too young. So England's ruled by a regency council led by the Archbishop Cranmer. And real Protestant reforms are actually put in place, more Lutheranisms and Calvinist ideas. We get the Book of Common Prayer, which is a new Protestant service, basically that they're running the church differently, not like the Catholics do. Edward dies at the young, tender age of 15. So daughter Mary, who is older, she's Catholic. She is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, remember, his first wife. She becomes Queen of England. She wants revenge, and she wants England to go back to the Catholic Church. She marries Philip II of Spain, who is the son of Charles V. This is enormously powerful. This is incredible, right? I mean, that's a powerhouse marriage. Philip II, from world, is going to be probably the most powerful Spanish monarch in history, and she's married to him. So you have an English-Spanish alliance here. Over Catholicism. So you have a blending of religion and political. So Mary burns over 300 Protestants at the stake, which gives her the nickname Bloody Mary. But she actually made England more Protestant because she and Philip were so detested by the English. She's Catholic. Many of the English were Protestant. And Philip is from Spain, not from England. So the people hate him anyway. She had her half-sister, Queen Elizabeth, who was Anglican, imprisoned. because she doesn't trust her. She doesn't want the people to get rid of her in favor of Mary, or in favor of Elizabeth. But Mary would end up dying after 5 years of rule, and she has no children. So you go to who's next in line. That's Elizabeth, and Elizabeth becomes this new, very, very powerful monarch. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. Okay, now another big name when it comes to the Reformation is John Calvin. You look at his years. He overlaps Martin Luther, but he comes a little bit later, so he carries on after Luther's gone, after he's dead. He studied humanism and law, similar to Luther. He's influenced by Luther, who came before him. He's from France. He flees France because France is a Catholic stronghold. He would write the Institutes of Christian Religion, basically presenting his ideas. The biggest idea we associate with John Calvin is predestination and the sovereignty of God. It's very controversial. In it, the belief with predestination is that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will be condemned, and there's nothing you can do about it. Absolutely nothing you can do about it. And it is very controversial because people don't want to think that that their free will has been taken away from them, that they cannot, believe in Jesus and do good things and go to heaven. Basically at birth, it's already been decided under predestination. Now, to continue with that, there are 3 tests that might prove you have been chosen. No guarantees, though. You have to openly profess your faith in Christ. You have to live a godly and decent life. And you must participate in the sacraments of baptism and communion. So he's with Luther here, right? He has the same 2 sacraments that Luther has. Wealth is not a sign of salvation. So he says, just because you're rich doesn't mean you get to go to heaven. That's not a sign that you have God's favor. The psychological effect of predestination, Calvinists believed they were doing God's work, which turned Calvinism into the most politically activist form of Protestantism. Now, Calvin is going to go to Switzerland, to a place called Geneva, and basically he's going to try to set up, he kind of creates this, I don't know if I'll call it a utopia, but a religious experiment. He became minister of Geneva in 1541, and the city council approved his church. Both the clergy and laity, meaning people who were non-members of the church, were included in church service. The consistory, the body that enforced the moral discipline, which included public punishment. They were big on flogging and stuff like that. Geneva becomes the center of Protestantism. Calvinism is going to spread. It spread to England, spread to Scotland, even France, which was a Catholic stronghold before, the Netherlands, and Eastern Europe. For the English, Calvinists would become known by a different name, the Puritans. And we know that the Puritans would come over to America. So there's John Calvin. Pretty harsh. Geneva is going to be a place where, they're not going to be able to dress in bright colors. It's really strict religious society, very. All right, so here's some Reformation chronology here. We get the Baptists, which are a little more radical, who will eventually end up in the Amish, who kind of pacifism and remove themselves from society. You get England joining into this just really because Henry VIII is a jerk and wants a divorce, but that will allow the Protestantism in, the Reformation in. And then Calvin comes just a little bit after that. His mainstay will be in Geneva, Switzerland, a little more harsh, a little more strict. It'll spread to other areas such as France and England. And from England, it will come to the New World. All right, so social impact of the Reformation. Well, there's little. The family. Marriage and sex, new views on it. Marriage was seen as more holy than celibate purity. In the Catholic Church, if you could be celibate, that was better than anything else. Go be a monk and not engage in sex. That was supposed to be awesome. But under the Protestants, the family is more important. Marriage is just like sacred relationship. And because of this, the clergy is not put above others like it was in Catholicism. Marriage was also a cure for the sin of lust. This is a human thing, this lust, this temptation. Well, under marriage, you can have sex and it's not a sin. And so that's very attractive to a lot of Protestants. Um, Monasticism, these monasteries, was abolished in Protestant states. They get rid of it. And the family becomes the center of human life. That's very important. So make sure you know this. Women, the roles of the wife and the mother was sanctified by Protestants, meaning that they don't have actual power like political power, but they have social power that they're seen as something important. Calvin was opposed to women rulers, but being a nun was no longer an option for women. So what opportunities did nuns have? Protestant states had traditional views of marriage, and Calvinist states had laws against spousal violence. You were still supposed to treat your wife with respect. So it's an interesting. In some ways, it shackles the woman, and in some ways, it protects them. Education in the Reformation. Protestants encouraged schools so that you could read the Bible, because remember, you're your own church. The human and the Protestants are influenced by humanists who believe in education. All right, for a wider audience, not just the elite, that people should educate themselves. Also, a priesthood of all followers creates a need for better education. Civic humanism, to be a better Christian, to be a better person in your city, you need to have a better education, which is very important for the advancement of the world, this spreading of education. Religious practices and popular culture. They alter religious ceremonies and images from Catholicism. No more indulgences, pilgrimages, relics, and saints. That's Catholic stuff. Protestants are getting rid of it. Some Protestants criticize customary entertainment. And the hardcore ones, like the Puritans, those Anabaptists, they tried to eliminate and reduce the holidays and feast days. They tried to get rid of theater, plays, and acting, and so they were pretty hardcore. Okay, secondary schools. All right, now the Catholic Church isn't going to sit back. So there's all this fighting, and really, in the long term, you can't beat Protestantism. Basically, people will get to some level religious freedom, but the Catholics don't want to lose all their people, so they have a Catholic Reformation. They reform themselves from within. So the historical debate was there a Catholic Reformation, or was it just a counter? Would we rather call it counter Reformation? A reform from within and as a reaction. Me personally, I consider it a little bit of both. But since it changes the church, I will go with the Catholic Reformation. It's a revival of the best form of medieval Catholicism, elements of mysticism, monasticism as forms of Catholic piety. You've got nuns and saints, because that's part of the Catholic Church. Older monastic orders such as the Benedictine monks, the Dominican monks, the Capuchins, vows of simplicity and living a life in service to Jesus. Not having mistresses and not being drunk priests and stuff like that. That's part of the Catholic Reformation. You get to Saint Teresa of Avila, a Spanish mystic nun. Here she explains her religious experience. I'm not going to read that out loud, though. And here you have some artwork. Now, the big one from the Catholic Reformation, of course, is the Society of Jesus, better known as Jesuits. This was started by a man you need to know by name, Ignatius of Loyola. It was a warrior who had he started off as a soldier who had a religious awakening. But unlike Martin Luther, he resolved his problems by submitting to the church, not creating a new one. He vowed to be a warrior for God. And he writes the spiritual exercises, and he creates the Jesuits, basically. They're recognized as a religious order in 1540. And these are what they swear by: absolute total obedience to the papacy, to the Pope, and a very strict discipline and hierarchy. Now, what is their goals? What should they do? Their biggest enemy is Protestants, and they're going to combat Protestantism through education in schools. They're also going to propagate, meaning spread, the Catholic faith among non-Catholics. So they're going to send missionaries to places like China, Japan, Indonesia. Remember, they are the best Catholic missionaries. And where they need to, they are willing to fight Protestantism to restore Catholicism in Europe. All right, so here's a map of Catholics and Protestants. You've got Calvinists, You got Calvinist influence. You got Roman Catholics here, and you got splotches of Protestantism in there. Anglican. This is a blending of Catholic and Protestantism. Here's Ignatius of Loyola. Again, very important. A revived papacy. The Pope, was that a wake-up call for the church? Well, Pope Paul III, he has this reform commission, where he's trying to do things to fix the church. However, that's kind of on the surface. He still practices nepotism, meaning he gives his family members jobs that they don't necessarily deserve, and he's living in palaces and living in luxury. He does, however, recognize the Jesuits, and he summons the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent is trying to settle, doctrinal differences, but the conservative Roman cardinals are unwilling to compromise. And the Cardinal Carafa, who becomes Pope Paul IV, was the first true pope of the Catholic Reformation. His reforms strengthened the Roman Inquisition. Think Spanish Inquisition, rooting out heretics and stuff. Has an index of forbidden books. Basically, you cannot read these books from Luther, Zwingli, and people like that. Council of Trent, what really changed? Not really a whole lot. Here's your chronology of the Catholic Reformation. Pope Paul, we recognize the Jesuits. We get the Roman Inquisition coming in. Council of Trent takes a couple years to not get really much done. This Council of Trent is going to meet on occasion throughout those years. Divisions between moderates, those who want some change, and then conservatives who don't want any change at all. Basically, it reaffirms traditional Catholic teachings of Scripture and tradition, faith getting you to heaven and good works getting you to heaven, opposite of what Martin Luther says. Sacraments, 7 sacraments. All right. And basically, Jesus, transubstantiation, Jesus' body being part of the blood and wine. Now, politics and wars of religion in the 16th century. What role did politics, religion, economic, and social conditions play in the 16th century? Well, there are quite a few. Catholics are devoted to one law and one head, absolute monarchy, directly tied to the Catholic Church. So stresses obedience to a supreme leader, who is the Pope. Calvinism appealed to those who supported political decentralization, and they opposed the hierarchy of the church. So we have some issues here. Now, French wars of religion, 30 odd years right here, a big deal. It can be a little confusing, so try to stay with me. All right, you got to know who the Huguenots are. They are French Calvinists, meaning they are Protestants. Most of France, the vast majority of France is, however, Catholic. They convert, their biggest converts actually happen at the top, however. 40 to 50% of the French nobility are Huguenots, but only 10% of the total population of France. And that just goes along with the fact that farmers are always conservative, right? Peasants are always conservative. They're not big on change. This included the House of Bourbon, which was a powerful family. They were next to the Valois family in line for the French throne. They rule an area called Navarre. And then you had the ultra-Catholics, these super Catholics, which was headed by the Guise family. In 1559, King Henry II is killed in a jousting tournament, and he has 3 sons left to him that will succeed him. Francis II was the eldest at 15 years of age, but he's very sickly. He married Mary Stuart, who was Mary, Queen of Scots. However, dies a year later. His wife, Catherine de' Medici, unable to compromise between the two extremes. She wants peace between Catholics, between Huguenots and Catholics. So there's a constitutional crisis and a revolt against the monarchy. The Huguenot nobles and towns revolt against the monarchy, and people have to answer this question: what's superior? Loyalty to one's state or one's belief? Is your church more important, or is France more important? The politiques, intellectuals who place politics and peace above religious beliefs. They're the ones that say, listen, it's not worth all this death and destruction. We're tearing our country apart. Let's have religious peace. They support religious toleration and moderation. In 1562, the Duke of Guise, however, massacres peaceful Protestants at Vassy. And then the worst one of all, the St. Bartholomew Days massacre in 1572. this happens at a marriage, basically, between Margot, sister of young King Charles IX, who marries the Huguenot King Henry of Navarre. So you have a Catholic marrying a Protestant. And you have all these Protestant leaders who are a lot of noblemen who come to this wedding. And the French Catholics, Duke of Guise, convinces Catherine, the widowed wife of the king, to murder the Huguenots while they're in town for the wedding. So they begin murdering them, and it just kicks in where people in the town start doing the same thing. Started in Paris on August 24th, then went on for 3 days of mindless slaughter around the country. Henry of Navarre, who was the groom, he was marrying the Catholic. He says, oh, no, I'm converting to Catholicism. That saves his life. In the end, 300,000 French Catholic or French Huguenots, French Protestants are killed. It's incredible. Doesn't end the fighting. It actually backfires against the ruling Valois family, the monarch's family, and it's going to lend strength to the Huguenots. So while the Huguenots gather their strength, they do regather themselves. The Guises form something called a Catholic League, funded by Philip II of Spain, who we know is super Catholic, the defender of Catholicism. They want the Guise family, on the throne. St. Bartholomew's Massacre. I mean, just so much bloodshed. All right, War of Three Henrys is pretty crazy. All right, Henry Guise, super Catholic. Henry III, he's from the Valois ruling family. He's Catholic as well. And then Henry of Navarre, who is a Bourbon. His family name is Bourbon, and he's actually a Protestant who's going to pretend to be Catholic to save his life. So Henry of Navarre actually becomes king after these other two dudes are assassinated. He's assassinated first, so then Henry becomes the king, and he's assassinated, and then boom, gets us to Henry of Navarre, who in the end gets killed too. Henry of Navarre becomes Henry IV, King of France. He, on the surface, converts to Catholicism because he is a politique. He basically means he's not that religious, to be honest. It's whatever's best for France. His quote here: "Paris is worth a mass. I can go to mass to have Paris to have control to end the religious wars in France," which he does. So he remarries Marie de Medici, and they have many children. He issues something important called the Edict of Nantes, which is religious toleration for Huguenots. This was out of political necessity. This allows Huguenots to have churches in certain areas, not everywhere, but they have basically safeholds, and that Huguenots can keep walls. If you're a noble, that you can have walls if you're a Huguenot, things like that. But in 1610, Henry is also assassinated by a Catholic fanatic who basically jumps into his coach and stabs him to death. They brutally torture and execute the man for that action. All right, there's your chronology. Again, it gets crazy. There's so much going on here. So much. All right, but we're nearing the end. Philip II of Spain, super Catholic himself, son of Charles V, who, remember, he retired from the Holy Roman Empire because everybody seemed to be against him. So Philip II inherits the Habsburg lands, Burgundy, Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, and those New World colonies. He wants religious conformity, sounds like Dad. A very aggressive use of the Spanish Inquisition. Extension of royal power. He is an absolute monarch. Very much so, absolute monarch. He wants Spanish dominance in Europe. He's getting it, at least for a while. He's got the Holy League. The Battle of Lepanto is his greatest victory. He beats the Turks, so he doesn't have to worry about Islam coming in and messing with him. He has some economic issues. A lot of gold and silver from the Americas, which is good to a point, but it does cause massive inflation, especially silver. Because he is so dedicated to Catholicism, he has a ton of very expensive wars. And so to pay for those wars, he's going to crush his people with taxation. They're the most taxed place in Europe. And his religious issues, like most Spanish, he believes he was chosen to save Catholicism. Again, he's very devout Catholic. The Inquisition will do very, very bad things to people. who are accused of being Protestants or accused of being Muslims or in non-Catholic faith. The rack, the blood eagle, so much torture. It's a dark and bloody time. The height of Spanish power under Philip II, you can see these areas of control that he has. He is immensely powerful. There he is. He's a dandy. He is going to rule for a long time, but he is going to face a lot of issues. There's revolt in his northern lands of the Netherlands. Let's go back here real quick. Here's the Netherlands. Look, France just hanging out by itself. Meanwhile, all this other stuff controlled by Philip II. Well, England's not, but so these are lands controlled by Spain, but they have an issue with Catholicism, or at least some of them do. So the prosperity of the provinces, it is a prosperous place through trade, but the north are a Germanic people who speak Dutch. The south speak French and Flemish. The north is going to become Protestant. The south is going to become Catholic, to make a long story short. It does have religious diversity, but you're basically going to get these two camps form up. So there's resentment against Philip's attempt to exert his control there. He wants to end Dutch noble privileges. That's those northern provinces that are Protestant. The Dutch hate that their taxes are used to help Spain out. That bothers them because they were prosperous. They're doing good, and now their money's being taken from them to basically pay for Spain's wars. Philip tries to crush this Protestantism by force. Dutch nobles are going to attack Catholic churches. Philip's going to send the Duke of Alva and 10,000 Spanish Italian troops to crush the revolt. You get a reign of terror, basically. Public execution of thousands of Calvinists. And Spain's going to levy these taxes on the Dutch. But all this does is make things worse. There's an increase in Calvinist conversion. And again, he's going to lose the northern Netherlands. You get William of Nassau, the Prince of Orange. He becomes the leader of the resistance to the Spanish. He unites the Dutch under his rule. He too is a politique. Remember, he's believing that religion takes a second seat to the state. He had the help from sea beggars, these pirates who were secretly hired by Queen Elizabeth of England to attack the Spanish troops. The Spanish Fury, Spanish mercenaries, unpaid, murder 7,000 more Dutch, all these thousands of people being killed in the name of religion and politics. The Catholic and the Calvinist Dutch unite under the Pacification of Ghent, 1576. All Dutch, regardless of religion, would unify under the William of Orange. Again, this is a politique situation, religious tolerance. You can be Catholic, you can be Protestant, it doesn't matter. We are Dutch. And that's first and foremost. Let's see. We'll sum some of this up. We'll skip that one, really. Philip is not having that much success here. William of Orange is eventually assassinated, but Spain would end up signing a truce in 1609, and we get the birth of the Dutch Republic. That isn't legally recognized until 1648, but basically Philip loses there. And there you have the division. Okay. Our last little part here with Queen Elizabeth. She becomes new Protestant queen after Bloody Mary dies. She rules for 45 years. She is incredible. She becomes, England under her becomes the leader of the Protestant nations. She is the originator of this worldwide empire, which is enormous. The Elizabethan age is cultural renaissance, such as Shakespeare and arts and entertainment happened under her. She's very moderate. She is definitely a politique. Her Act of Uniformity and Act of Supremacy were revised to ease Catholics and Protestants. She says that she is the head of England, the English realm. She does not say she's the head of the church. And that's to make Catholics feel better because they're still devoted to, of course, to the Pope. There are Catholics and Puritan discontents because she's moderate. Hardcore Catholics aren't going to like her, and hardcore Protestants, which is the Puritans, aren't happy with her because she's giving things to Catholics. Her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, she is booted off the throne of Scotland, and she flees to England. So Elizabeth puts her under house arrest for 14 years, and Mary Queen of Scots is behind several assassination plots on Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth eventually has her actually in prison and then executes her to get her out of the way. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England of all traces of Catholicism. That's important. Her foreign policy, she is very cautious, very moderate. She doesn't want war with anybody. She's going to be very sneaky about stuff. She encourages buccaneers, basically pirates, to raid Spanish ships. The most notable of those was Francis Drake, who she would end up knighting. He's a pirate, but she knights him because he's doing a service to the crown. She provides aid to the Dutch Calvinists against Spain, again, under the radar. And she rejects Philip II's proposal for marriage. He tries to marry her. She doesn't marry anyone, and she gets the title of the Virgin Queen. Spanish Armada, 1588, big turning point. Philip wants to capture England since she wouldn't marry him. He wants to return it to Catholicism. His fleet is not prepared. They're hoping for a miracle from God. Many of the ones, when he launches them, realize they can't win, can't beat the English. But they think that God's on their side, and they're hoping for a miracle. The Armada is crushed by the British, and then storms finish it off. This marks the end of Spain's dominant era and the beginning of its decline. Britain is now the most powerful state, for the moment, under Elizabeth, in Europe. So she's fantastic. Here's your chapter timeline. I'll leave it on here. You can pause it and kind of look at this to get a visual. And again, you might want to go through these discussion questions. And that's it. A lot of stuff to process there. So you're really going to, my advice to you is note cards, note cards, note cards. All right. Thanks for listening.